Olá pessoal, o episódio de hoje será todo em inglês. Ativem as legendas aqui ou aqui, enfim, ativem as legendas. Critical moments like the one we are experiencing leave some of us with a strong sense of disorientation, a strong sense that we are experiencing something that has never been experienced before, a sense that unprecedented changes are taking place or will take place. What are the effects of crisis in our relationship with time? That is, with our perception of change and permanence, events and processes? What are the implications of these changes to historical thought? To discuss such questions, the Laboratory for the Study of Theory and History of Historiography, and the Interdisciplinary Center for Theoretical Studies, NIET, in partnership with HH Magazine, presents this series, whose objective is to bring together specialists of the field from Brazil and abroad to address specific aspects related to the current pandemic from the point of view of theory and history of historiography. Today, I, Hugo Merlo, talk with Professor Zoltán Boldizsár about the relationship between crisis and historical thinking. So I'm here with Professor Zoltán Boldizsár. Professor Shimon is an assistant professor at Leiden University and a research fellow at Bielefeld University. Professor, thank you very much for joining us today and for answering our questions. Okay, Professor, in your book, History in Times of Unprecedented Change, you claim that after the Second World War, Western societies have undergone a major shift in how they make sense of novelty and historical change. Whereas the modern idea of history domesticated the novelty by framing it in a developmental and processual temporality, we are currently living in disruptive times and experiencing unprecedented changes, and our visions of the future seem much more indeterminate. This notion of the unprecedented seems to have a link with the idea of crisis, which in its original sense denotes a situation in which change is imminent and the future is very uncertain. To what extent does the notion of unprecedented, that is something radically new, relate to the idea of crisis?
Hi Hugo, hello everyone, and first of all, very many thanks for the invitation to participate in the Crisis and Historicity series. Yeah, I watched the previous episodes, so I have to say that it will be very hard to live up to the standards you set with those previous episodes, but we can try our best. Then I will just go on and address your question right away on the relationship between notions of the unprecedented and crisis. Well, yes, you are right. There is certainly a link. And the link has to do with change, uncertainty, and, well, first of all, with the modern idea of history, but in an extremely complex and perhaps also surprising way. Let's start with what's common knowledge about modern history, with what's the received view, which is, I will take it as one side of the equation. So this one side would be that, as it is often pointed out, and largely it is pointed out by crediting the work of Reinhard Koselleck, that the modern idea of history as a developmental process came to exist on the premise of experiencing already happening novelty, on experiencing that times are new, or on the premise of opening up of the future towards prospective change. So in that sense, history is the condition of possibility of crisis. So crisis can occur because novelty takes place, because novelty is looming on the horizon, and because that novelty is largely unfamiliar. So change to this unfamiliar new condition takes place, and that we experience as crisis. Now, there are, of course, many other notions of crisis related to the worsening of conditions, but here I would like to focus on the extent to which crisis is inherent in the temporal constitution of the modern idea of history. And then this would be one side of the equation. And then the other side is that the modern idea of history also serves as a crisis management. So it is both the precondition of crisis and the tool to manage the crisis that it enables to take place. And the crisis management part is nothing other than putting history to work by integrating experienced or expected novelty into a larger historical trajectory, by seeing this novelty together with the old in a way that both old and new appear as part of a longer developmental process. So this is history as crisis management. It tames the new, taming the shock of the new. The shock of the new is the crisis, which is enabled by the idea of history because the future is open. And at the same time, by historical thinking, you already integrated that novelty or tame it into this larger process. Again, this is history as crisis management, taming the new, taming the shock of the new, by looking for precedents in the past and by crafting a story of continuity between past, present, and possible futures, which now no longer seem, that much radically alien or threatening. So what this means is that to the modern idea of history, nothing is unprecedented in principle. The crisis, it does enable on the one hand and manages and fixes on the other, are crises that involve first novelties, which compared to today's unprecedented novelties do not really come out as very radical. And second, they are futures which, again, as compared to today's future prospects, are far less uncertain and far less novel, or are uncertain and novel in a different modality. What I mean is that the uncertain and new futures of modernity were typically aligned with 19th century historical ideologies that postulated a desired course of future development. So the future was uncertain in its details, but it was expected to unfold in the shape of a historical process according to scenarios that people tried to figure in advance, in ideologies, in predictions, and they tried to predict, foresee in many ways by many techniques. Now, contrary to this, today's futures that I align with the notion of unprecedented change are prospects which, by definition, are unfathomable to us. So these prospects are not simply unprecedented in the sense that they promise that something will take place for the first time in our known world. They are prospects that open up a whole new reality and a whole new existence, or a whole new plane of existence, or a whole new mode of existence. So my typical examples are the technological singularity in the technological context, or in the technology context, and the transgression of planetary boundaries in the Anthropocene context. So the former notion refers to the point at which greater than human intelligence is created, likely followed by an intelligence explosion in which superintelligence creates greater and greater intelligences over time, probably in an explosive fashion. And the latter, the planetary boundaries concept, is a concept of Earth system science. It identifies a zone of safe operational space for humanity within these boundaries, meaning that once these boundaries, which are manifold, including human-driven biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and climate change, these are one of the planetary boundaries. Once those boundaries are transgressed, the changes that are expected to follow can be as radical as pushing the Earth system to a condition that no longer supports the flourishing of human societies, or even human life for that matter. In both these scenarios of unprecedented change, we lose control over initially human-induced transformations, and the future lies beyond what is graspable to the human mind. And the novelties and crises that these prospects represent are crises that modern historical thinking cannot cope with. What I want to say is that the crisis management of modern history, the second half of the equation, as we talked about in the first place, the idea of history enables crisis to take place, and at the same time, second half of the equation is that it manages those crises. Let's say it just smooths time into this processual developmental scenario. But that part, the crisis management part of modern history, it just goes bankrupt in facing these unprecedented changes. So yet still, if you look around, you see many claims everywhere that these prospects of unprecedented change are anything but unprecedented, meaning that for some reasons, we keep on projecting modern historical thinking over these prospects and try to fit this novelty, this unprecedented novelty, into scenarios of developmental processes. And I think it just doesn't really work out well. And I also think that this does more damage than good today, because saying that this new thing is actually an old thing in a developed shape conveys the message that we know this thing from the past. And when we face these unfathomable futures, or we face these futures which are unfathomable to the human mind, then this is really a counterproductive strategy. it only pushes us deeper and deeper into the crisis we are facing. So just to sum up or to answer your question, as clearly as possible, yes, there is a link between notions of crisis and unprecedented change. You can say that the prospect of unprecedented change is the kind of crisis itself that modern history cannot manage to cope with. It's the kind of crisis that pushes even modern historical thinking into a crisis.
Technology, the ground on which the two realms of history and nature have met and interpenetrated each other in our time, points back to the connection between the concepts of nature and history as they appear with the rise of the modern age in the 16th and 17th centuries. The connection lies in the concept of process. Both imply that we think and consider everything in terms of processes and are not concerned with single entities or individual occurrences and their special separate causes. The keywords of modern historiography, development and progress, were in the 19th century also the keywords for the then new branches of natural science, particularly biology and geology, the one dealing with animal life, and the other even with non-organic matter in terms of historical processes. But the experience which underlies the modern age's notion of process, unlike the experience underlying the ancient notion of immortality, is by no means primarily an experience which man made up in the world surrounding him. On the contrary, it sprang from the despair of ever experiencing and knowing adequately all that is given to man and not made by him. Against this despair, modern man summoned up the full measure of his own capacities. Despairing of ever finding truth through mere contemplation, he began to try out his capacities for action, and by doing so, he could not but become aware that wherever man acts, he starts processes. The notion of process is first of all not an objective quality of either history or nature, but the inevitable result of human action. The first result of man acting into history is that history becomes a process. And the most cogent argument for man's acting into nature in the guise of scientific inquiry is that today, in Whitehead's formulation, nature is a process. Thank you very much, Professor. That was very interesting, very informative. And what you said actually connects very well with what we had planned to ask you in the following questions. The second question that we have prepared for you is a long question, but I asked the public to kindly keep up with us. We will arrive at the question. You begin your book, History in Times of Unprecedented Change, which, just a side note here for the audience, this is your previous book. You have a super new book that came out in the last weeks, the Epochal event, and we are going to touch in the subject of the evental and the processual as well. But anyways, you begin your book History in Times of Unprecedented Change stating that contrary to common belief, history is not concerned with the past. It is all about novelty. History's primary concern is not with what is considered to be old, but that which looms on the horizon and which, in the present, is conceived of as new and different from what has been before. In many ways, indeed, the current coronavirus crisis has imposed an unprecedented situation, at least from the point of view of the current generation. Perhaps we can say that the historicity of this crisis lies in the perception that we are experiencing a singular moment in which the world to come, although unpredictable in terms of its contours, will be certainly different from the world we have lived in before the pandemic. In several occasions, however, historians have been framing their interventions in the public debate by drawing comparisons and analogies between the COVID-19 pandemic with other pandemic experiences of the past, such as the Spanish flu, the 14th century plague, and so forth. It is as if the main task of historical thinking would still be to make sense of this event, the corona crisis, within a continuous developmental or processual temporality, instead of grasping the historicity of our present moment considering its own disruptive character from the standpoint of an evental temporality. And the question is, considering that, could you speak a little bit more on this difference between processual and evental temporality that you have been working on? Could the coronavirus crisis be addressed from this conceptual pair as well?
Yes, again, super complex question. And before I start to answer, just a quick note which just came to my mind about when you quoted from the book. These are actually the very first sentences of of the book that, contrary to common belief, history is not concerned with the past. It's all about novelty. Of course, it doesn't mean that history is not about the past. Of course, history is as much about the past as about anything else, but its concern is the future. So this is just a small clarification before people start to think that I'm claiming madness, denying that history has to do with the past. Of course, it's not the case, but its concern, its chief concern, is that which looms in the horizon. Okay, so the question on the distinction between processual and evental temporalities, which I introduced in a chapter in a book edited by Marek, Tamm and Laurent Olivier. And in the Epochal event book, I get into, or I try to explore the kind of event which triggers the change. But the distinction between processual and evental temporalities, generally speaking, is heavily linked with a distinction between the modern sense of historicity and the alternative sense of historicity emerging since the middle of last century, the one that I link with unprecedented change, the one that I think revolves around unprecedented change. So I think that this is an emerging new historical sensibility or sense of historicity that is gaining prominence since the middle of the last century. And evental temporality is related to that, while processual temporality, the notion intends to capture the temporality of modern historical thinking. So the time that in a directional manner flows through developmental processes in modern historical thinking, that's processual. And it informs politically diverse projects such as nation building processes, scenarios to achieve a classless society, or the gradual empowerment of emancipatory politics. Or generally speaking, nation-building processes and scenarios to achieve a classless society are, linked with diverging ideologies, right? But yet, nevertheless, they pretty much share at their fundament this sort of processual temporality to arrive at their future condition. With respect to such processual historicity, I usually like to point at Hannah Arendt, who was convinced that making sense of everything by seeing them within larger processes is pretty much the specificity of the modern world. And to the modern mind, everything occurs within these larger continuous processes which invest these things with meaning. So things are meaningful in as much and by virtue of their role, place and function within these processes of continuity. So that's about the processual temporality of modern historical thinking. And evental temporality, in contrast, it refers to a sort of an eruptive time, to a way in which unprecedented change is triggered by the outburst of a momentous game-changer event that ends up being perceived as one that separates two worlds, two incommensurable realities, a pre-evental and the post-evental one. Evental temporality brings about this radical novelty of a wholly new reality that doesn't simply develop out of past conditions over the course of history conceived as a process of continuity. Now, the question is whether the current global pandemic represents unprecedented change, and if it can be seen as exhibiting this evental temporality. Now, that's a very tricky question, because for sure, we can project multiple interpretive grids over singular occurrences. The similar way we can explain data through multiple competing theories, right? Of course, I can make sense of this thing by these notions. But then again, there is also Hartmut Rosa, for example, who would consider COVID-19 as an instance of deceleration in his framework of, or in the framework of his theory of social acceleration. And alternatively, some political thinkers of the left would probably align with Zizek in seeing, yet another occasion for revitalizing the idea of communism as a solution or whatever comes out of the pandemic. The same way as did Badiou already with in the case of the Arab Spring not so long ago. In much a similar manner, I could of course say that, yes, here you have unprecedented change and here you have evental temporality. But the case is it's really a bit more trickier, and seeking confirmation of large-scale theories in current states of affairs is it's simply a category mistake. And Zizek makes this category mistake, Badiou makes the category mistake, Agamben makes the category mistake these days by trying to confirm their large-scale theories in actually small-scale current events. Or we don't know how big scale this event is. That's exactly the point. I would be very happy to try to avoid making this category mistake, because at the moment we are still living the event. We are living the global pandemic. And to be able to think the event from the inside, of course, we may recourse to these categories and we may recourse to these notions. And it may be useful to recourse to the categories of my work as well. Still, there is a difference between living the event and looking at the event from the post-evental reality. Because from within the event, we cannot see the shape of the post-evental world to come, if it is really unprecedented change. For sure, it's actually a fashionable thing to do, to write essays how COVID-19 changes the world, what comes after, and so on. You can read by now really probably thousands of articles and columns on the topic. But in fact, in midst of the event taking place, if it's really a game changer event, then we have zero idea of the world it brings about. If we knew how that world would be, that would mean that we already know the future game. And if we already know the future game, then the change is not really a game changer change, right? Because even before the change takes place, you know the future game. So the post-evental reality, if you know it in advance, is not really a new reality. And until we see that new reality, we cannot measure the post-evental world to the pre-evental one, and we cannot decide if the event brought about a new reality, a new mode of existence, or just really something minor change as compared to what has been before. So if after the event we think that it did, then yes, we had unprecedented change and evental temporality. But again, we will stand a chance to settle the question only after the event has concluded, or after we think that the event has concluded. Again, this is not an argument against trying to use the conceptual pair of processual and evental temporalities, or the notions of any other larger scale theories, because it can really illuminate our situation and help us navigate through it, right? To help us make sense of what's happening. But it's equally important to see its limitations due to the fact that we are living the event. So we are not in the position to attempt confirmation to any degree of certainty.
This was the first part of the 8th episode of the series Crisis in Historicity. As usual, we ask you to please hit the like button down below and share this video with your friends and colleagues. And why not take the chance to like and follow the profiles of HH Magazine, Letches and Yet on the social networks. All the links that you need are in the description of this video. There, you'll also find links to the recent production of Professor Szymon. Well, see you again next week. Bye bye.